Hi, everyone. This is a talk I gave at Lean Agile Scotland last week, and I just really wanted to make a video copy of that so all of you can watch that at home who weren't able to attend that conference. So stick around and we're going to walk through how do you group teams for fast flow. So first of all, there's a few things you will learn in this presentation. First, you can never create a group of teams. You must craft an environment where teams coalesce into a group. Anything else is a delusion. The story of the emperor's new clothes. Your key design constraint is humans. The information flows between humans and alignment are the key. Your secondary constraint is the type of change that you want to flow fast, where it flows, and how it flows between those teams. So here's a little bit of spoilers just to tell you what the sections are going to be. First, we're going to send some underperforming ideas into early retirement. We're going to look at human information flows. We're going to look at human alignment, and we're going to look at coupling and cohesion of teams. And lastly, this one is really hard to explain. It's unspoken ideas that people don't necessarily know they have. So let's think about this first one. How do companies decide on groups of teams? Normally, it's something like this, right? There's a private video call with all the directors and executives, the big Q4 reorg, and you get everyone together and you say, okay, we have to really sort out what we're going to do. And you get a PowerPoint presentation or maybe a Miro slide deck if it's a more modern company, and you twiddle together some boxes and you have a debate about who's going to go where. What's inside of those conversations? How are they figuring this stuff out? Typically, this is what I'm seeing. Typical strategy number one, you get 16 workers in your company. You say, okay, manager one says, you take half of the teams and I'll take the other half. Divide and conquer team management. And you get an org chart that looks like this. Big boss at the top, mid bosses, mini bosses, and then a bunch of workers. And we group them saying, oh, that you're a team and you're a team and that's a team, and I got a group around that. So that's a group of teams, right? What's the purpose? Just a self-reflection. What is the purpose of strategy one? Do we see evidence for fast flow of change as something that the management team made a priority in their thinking? Typical strategy number two, we have to manage the complexity in this company. We have 9 topics. And so for those of you who don't know, that's skyline of Toronto, currywurst out from Berlin. We have the British pound, we have the euro and different cities and different food on this thing. So different topics, a lot of complexity. How are we going to sort this out? And this is what we see, right? Time and time again, we see, okay, well, we're going to group those by similarity, right? Those nouns or those ideas are similar. They belong together because they're similar. So we're going to have a group for money, a group for cities, a group for food. And what's really cool is we're going to tell ourselves, now we have excellence built into similar topics. So all the money teams are going to know everything about money. They're going to be an excellent center of money. They're going to know everything. Obvious issue here is none of those things actually interact together. There's no reason to. And if they do interact, it's edge cases and even corner cases or artificially created cases. It's not the mainline interaction, the 90% case that's happening all the time. What is the purpose of strategy 2? You can't tell me. This is a YouTube video. Maybe write it in the comments, but just reflect on that. And here's what the leadership team comes up with. They took those 2 strategies, say, okay, we got these topics, we have these people, we have to divide and conquer. So I'm going to create a currencies and meals org. Mini boss 1, you're going to take the pound and Canadian dollar. Mini boss 2, you're going to take Quebecois poutine and Berlin currywurst, and you're going to be the currencies and meal org. And then the other org here, you're going to take some cities. And we don't know what to do with these 3. There are always conflicting problems with them, you know, the euro and the haggis and Toronto. We don't know what's wrong, but we get a lot of complaints about them across the org. We're going to create one team, put all our problems in that team, and just they're going to fix it. They're going to have one focus to fix those things. And this is a very typical org. This is something we see time and time again across the industry. So let's fast forward to the last day of planning week for Q4. So we're going into Q4 now. Let's figure out what we planned. So we have a week of planning with those 4 teams. What did they plan? Good news, everyone. Our Rock and Q plan is fully packed. A fully packed Q4 plan. What could go wrong? So let's do another jump, go to the end of Q4. You know, everybody was busy doing lots of work for the whole quarter. 25% of projects were delivered. Now, at some companies, that might be higher or lower. And unfortunately, a big factor in that is how much they're willing to rewrite history and say, well, actually, we only agreed to this and political wheeling and dealing and haggling with agreements to change that number into something else. And I've seen that in action. I've seen 5 competing versions of a key KPI in a company. So everybody could say they did a good job, and none of those KPIs were the same thing, even though they were all the same name. Everyone feels helpless to fix it, right? They're trapped into a system that designs them into this failure. So you get a message on LinkedIn. A consultant for an agile scaling framework offers a solution. They say, hey, here's my PowerPoint presentation. The problem is in your company is that individual teams are iterating at their own speed. And you think work is on track, and they discover they're not. And you can see it in their illustration here. You have this team, they do work, and then we have over here work, and they're working at different speeds, right? It's not lined up rigidly. And then we get this big explosion, and it's not very good. So we have to fix that. So obviously the solution is everyone must iterate at the same cadence. So we're going to do an iteration of work, everyone at the same time, lock it in. Maybe we call it a sprint. And at the end of that sprint, we integrate with our mainline solution, whatever that is. That way we avoid that everybody tries to integrate at the end surprise. And we're going to schedule the work that they're going to do. Pretend that a 12-week cycle is predictable of what kind of work will go in. In fact, we might even pretend 24 weeks into the future is completely predictable. And so we're going to call that the agile choo-choo train. We're going to take those teams, I'm going to call them team topologies teams. And I say, I'm going to group those by delivery schedule. All those teams need to deliver at the same schedule. I'm going to group them that way. And because the work is predictable, we are going to map out our project dependencies. Project dependencies here, this team needs something from that team, and this team needs something from that team. At least these are the anticipated dependencies. These aren't the actual dependencies. These are the ones you think you might have 24 weeks into the future before you know what you're going to build in any real detail. So chances are, as you go further down this map, it's going to get worse as the pressure builds to deliver those big commitments. But regardless, we've grouped our teams together based on delivery commitments and dependencies between them. So what was the purpose of strategy 3? What did we do? Again, please, if you actually know, you can write it down in the comments. I'd love to know. I have an idea. I have a good idea. I don't think it was fast flow of value. So let's fast forward to the last day of planning week for Q1. Good news, our PI program increment for the agile release train is fully packed, and delivery dependencies on the agile release train are mapped. So it sounds good, right? We're fully in control of the problem. And then we get to something like this, right? And this is a real organization. It's been scrubbed and cleaned, but it's real. Yellow boxes are teams, and the white boxes are the release trains. It's not good, right? So those lines are your dependencies, and we can see we just have a staggering amount of cross-team dependencies. In fact, very few inter-team dependencies, but this is where we ended up because we had teams grouped by similarity and then told they have to deliver together at the same time, and something's wrong. But what's really cool is at least we can see the mess, right? With just using strategy 1 and 2, we couldn't see this mess. Now it's visible. We still didn't fix anything. We still have 25% of projects delivered on time, with the political finagling to pretend that number is higher or lower, or just getting lucky. Or the really interesting trend I see is teams being very selective to only work on projects where there will be no dependencies. Even if it's the most valuable thing, they're going to avoid that and instead pick projects where they can have good looking delivery metrics. So let's think about this, right? We had 3 strategies: divide and conquer, group teams by similarity, and group teams by delivery schedule. Why didn't those strategies help? Posi would. Purpose of system is what it does, not what you intended it to do. Right? So what did we do? What did the system do for us? We had divided workload of managers, distance teams from other teams, even the ones that need to interact regularly, like Toronto, Canadian dollar, and poutine. The illusion of predictability, right? Pretending that we can predict 12 weeks into the future. We did that. And it worked. Some people really believed it, right? So this is what the purpose was. And forcing all teams to deliver some artifact, not a valuable artifact, right? It just delivers some artifacts before it's ready or after it's ready. Both were not, those aren't great, right? There's a point to teams working on their own cadence. What purpose should our systems be serving, right? And I think that's pretty much right here. You have some idea in your company, you want that to be converted into value. It's done through change, and it's done efficiently through fast flowing changes, right? Many small changes, time and time again. The industry's been talking about this for decades. Many small changes stacked up really fast. That's the best way to achieve our value. So we need to do that. Let's have some fun, right? Let's hack in to the brain of whoever's managing this company and see if we can change their mind. So somehow we hack in, open up the software in their brain and say, okay, well, let's take a look at your priorities as a manager. Management priority 1, that's an array, that's an ordered array, right? So the first one in there, first priority, command and control, right? And we saw that was quite evident. Predictability came in second, and then fast flow. If there was room for fast flow, we put it in. But what if we rewrite some code, right? Just make a one-line change that, okay, actually fast flow is going to the top, and all that other stuff, like, yeah, we can do it. It's important, but like, let's push it down and start with fast flow. So what do we do? We discover something interesting, which is grouping teams is actually not the point. Now, I know this is a talk about how to group teams, but you should not start trying to create the groups, right? This is the wrong approach. Groups are a side effect of working with humans, right? Somehow we need groups just because we're working with humans, but fast flow is what we're after. How do we make groups work in a fast flow way? So a group can happen at any time, by the way. It doesn't mean it's a good group or a bad group. It's just something that happens. And they happen with or without management drawing something, right? And I'm going to explain that to you very soon, and it's going to make a lot of sense. But just because management draws an org chart doesn't mean that's what your company looks like. And I think a lot of you understand that. And it's like plants, right? You can have a beautiful garden where everything's perfectly manicured, or just total wilderness where there's vines crawling in across the ground, but it's still a plant. And so a group is like that. So we're going to dig into this now. Fast flowing groups happen when we correctly enable 4 keys: human information flows, human alignment, coupling and cohesion of teams, unspoken ideas people don't actively think about. So let's start here. Human information flows. Human to human bandwidth is not infinite, right? So how should we think about the flow of information between humans to keep fast flow of change? Let's think about Alice sending a message to Bob. Alice says, our meeting's at 3 p.m. Great work, looking forward to it. I'll bring coffee. Thanks. Simplify that a bit and abstract away. We have something that looks like this network diagram. Alice says, I want you to know this. Bob says, here's me showing you I know it. Alice says, great, now I know that you know it. None of these lines are for free, right? Each line costs something to transmit. Each arrowhead costs something to send from Alice, costs something to receive from Bob. There's probably a limit to how many arrows they can receive. And there's probably something else interesting, which is how related they are to one another and how much context they share influences the size of message that needs to be sent. So if Alice knows Bob really well, maybe Alice can send a very short message, like you might do with your best friend. And then if Alice doesn't know Bob, we might need to see a lot more context being put into that message. And I think we've all experienced that, trying to explain something that to your friends who know you well is easy for your friends to understand. Somebody completely different, hard to explain it to them. You have to walk back and explain a lot more context. Let's think about how many arrows we can actually put onto any person. Small network of people, let's call it 6 people. Let's say they all work with each other. And of course, they don't all need to interact with each other all the time, but let's just think about this. It's a lot. But if we get to 26 people, it's not going to work, right? So we cannot create an organizational design where we assume 26 people is going to work. We cannot put that into our design. We should design something that's constrained to human scale. The 6 people, I think that works for humans. 26 model where everybody has all kinds of very close-knit relationships with 26 people all the time, sharing tons of information. There's not even enough hours in the day to do that. So I don't think that's going to work, right? We have to figure out, how do we make human scale organizations? So one of the things there is proxying information, and this is a way to solve that. People communicating on behalf of other people and maintaining relationships. So Alice proxies a message through Bob so that Chris gets it. And Alice says, I want Chris to know this. And Bob forwards that to Chris saying, I want you to know this. And there's already something interesting is we're entering into a type of waste and information degradation, right? Maybe it was important that Bob said, actually, Alice wants you to know this. Something strange happened there. And then Chris says, I know this. And it could be that Bob's not as qualified as Alice to actually verify that Chris understands it. And we could have a lot of waste in this situation. We have misunderstanding just through this proxying. And this is just a artifact of having to do this. So we have to be careful with where we apply this and be careful that we don't bottleneck information so that there's only one way, where it needs to be regenerative somehow. But we have to be careful about this. This is the thing is, right? Proxying information is costly, and at some scale, you can't avoid it. So let's think about information flows and how we're working, right? So we have some people we interact with very frequently, and some people we interact with very seldom. And we usually have higher shared context with our friends than strangers or people you just vaguely know. You have higher trust with your closer friends than you do with just random people you know about. And there's probably smaller group size, right? So if we think about this a little bit more systems networking, we find out, you might actually have 4 tiers of service that you give to other people, right? Tier 1, very small group, high interaction, high shared context, high trust group. Tier 4, a lot of people can get in there, but we're not going to interact as often. We're not going to have as deep a shared context. We're going to have lower trust. So where should people in your team be? If you have those rings of trust around you, people you interact with all the time and people you rarely interact with. And I think that's obvious. Right? That's here. The people you interact with the most should be your team. And if it's not the case, something's wrong. And the people in your group of teams, right? So where should others in your group of teams be? And I think that is also kind of obvious. It's this next ring out because the innermost ring is consumed by your team. Now the team might belong to the group, but all those people in the group need to be second closest, not third or fourth or fifth closest. Think about that, right? You have your team, group of teams, and then other groups as we stretch out. So how do we get people into those tiers, right? So how do we get people to the right orbits around each individual person? What about this? What if we make an org chart and say we have a big boss and some mid bosses and mini bosses, and we create groups of teams like this, and we say that's a group of teams and they'll be in the right orbit. I think we need to take an art history break. Let's take an art history break. I would like to show you Le Tresson des Images. It's a 1929 painting of a wooden pipe. Actually, I don't know if it's wood. And it says, "This is not a pipe." And I think this is very important. It's one of my favorite paintings. And a lot of people misunderstand this. They look at this pipe and they think, well, the intention of the artist is to shock you with something that's contradictory. It's not the point. The point of this is not to shock you with a contradiction and say, well, of course that's a pipe. It's clearly a pipe. Why would you write it's not a pipe under it? I'm tired of these artists just, oh, look at me. I'm so fancy. I have contradictory art. It's so important. That's not the point. I understand there's a lot of art like that today. That's not the point of this painting. The point here is to make you consider, it's in the name, the treachery of images. And it's actually the reaction you had. It's not a pipe. It's actually not a pipe, right? This is not actually a pipe. This is actually a painting. It's not a pipe. It's a representation of a pipe. And this is the point. You cannot pick up this pipe. You cannot smoke this. You cannot smash it to pieces. You can't put a little daffodil into the opening. You can't do anything with it. It's not a real pipe. This is not a pipe. But the treachery of images is so strong, it convinced you for just a moment that it was a pipe. And some of you might have been ready to really say, this is nonsense. Of course it's a pipe. Don't lie to me. And this is the problem. We have another name for this, which is the map and the territory. So sometimes the map does not match the territory. Think about this. You go into a restaurant, you order a hamburger, looks like that on the menu, and then you get this plastic thing here. You're going to be very upset. Or you go to a children's store, you buy this toy hamburger for your child, and you open the box and you get the real hamburger in the box. Like, that's also quite scary. You'd probably be even more concerned, actually, to find a real hamburger in a box in a children's store. This is strange. And this is what happens when the map does not match the territory. The map's not useful, and we're shocked and disappointed. So I would like to introduce to you my own artwork, which I call The Treachery of Upper Management Creating Org Charts on a Private Video Call, because this does not create a group of teams. This is a picture. This is a representation of something hypothetical. This could be the plastic hamburger that comes when you order a real one. Just drawing this picture does not create a group of teams. There are real things you have to do if you want the landscape to look like this, right? If you have a painting of some mountains, we need to actually have mountains there. How do you create mountains? You don't just paint them and say it's a representation of a mountain and will it into existence. You have to move the tectonic plates and shove them up onto each other so they form mountains over millennia. The point is we need real forces at play to make things look like this. The map should look like the territory, not be the emperor's new clothes where we pretend things work that way. Just because you draw it in a slide deck doesn't mean it exists. So we have all models. All models are wrong. Some models are useful, even though they're wrong. And then org charts that are detached from reality are not in the same subgroup of useful models. So let's go back and think about that question. How do we get people into the right orbits? Sorry, better question. What conditions need to exist so we get people into the right orbits? And I want you to think about that, right? We saw that earlier. The more people talk, the closer they can be, right? We need them to interact. So communication frequency goes up, their social proximity goes up. They might not always like each other, but this is a trend line. There's probably some thick error bars on that, but the more you interact with these people, the closer you're going to be to them. And so we need to bring these people on that trend line closer to one another. I like to think about these interactions this way. We can have conversations with each other that are about the work or about socialization. We have work conversations that are about the company and conversations that are about individuals. So you can have going for coffee together, a one-on-one catch-up call, or sometimes you see the speed dating or Slack plugins like Donut, which match you with some random people. After work pizza parties, team building events, playing Quake 2 together. I did that at a company. It was fantastic. Co-location of people, innovation hackathons, lots of great opportunities in there to do social focus about the company. And then you have about the work, but about the individual. One-on-one skill development, skill building guilds, right? So you see a DevOps guild to talk about cloud technologies. We're not talking about anyone's project. We're talking about how to use Terraform. Knowledge sharing, fun hackathons where you do a hackathon just for fun. Maybe you have a finance company using VR goggles. It's probably not going to actually be about the company, but the individual wanted to do it, and it's kind of about work. And you also have other things that are very specifically about work and about the company. I think this is the most underserved area. Monthly business reviews with an actual debate about what's going on in the business, not a status report. Global architecture review of the software, of the product. Building a shared roadmap together, not trickle down a roadmap or create one in a silo and hand it over. Creating a strategy together, not creating a strategy in isolation. Team API mapping. How's my team working with yours? How do we interact? Let's build that common understanding. OKRs, KPIs, having shared outcomes. We're going to talk about shared outcomes soon. But this is a map of ways we can bring people together, right? So increasing the connections in each category. And you'll do different ones at different times for different reasons, but this is kind of a way to look at that. That's how we bring people into closer orbits, right? Those are the things we need to do more frequently with one another in the group. And who are the right people? Like, which teams actually belong together? This is actually a very interesting question. It's not which manager has the other manager that reports to somebody. It's something else will bring these teams together, right? We can't use this divide and conquer stuff. So to understand which teams need to be grouped, we need to first talk a little bit about human alignment. And we're going to come back to human information flows after that. So we have to kind of take a detour to make it make sense. Let's think about human alignment. This is a team. Let's imagine a team in a complex space. And this space here represents product, process, people, and technology. So your team might have a goal saying, we want to be here. We're there. We want to be here. There's other teams doing some stuff. And it could be that delta can represent a lot of things. Very complicated topic. This is a metaphor for change. We want to move from one place to another. It could be that's a product change. It could be that's a cultural change, right? We have this culture. We want that one now. It could be a combination of those things. It could be multiple things we need to change at once. It could be a process change. You have to figure that out. But the point is, in the simplified 2D representation of that very complicated topic, you have a team in one place. You want to move it to a new place somewhere. How do you get there, right? Other teams have their own things going on too. Should you group the teams that are most like yours, right? And just think about that through that people, process, product, technology lens. Maybe it could be that the thing that makes them super similar to yours is they all use Django and they work on headless APIs and they work on Kanban processes and have a really strong feedback culture. So it would be easy to get along with them. Should they go into a group? Or what about this? They have completely different stuff, but it's closer to where you want to be. So should we take this team that's nothing like those teams and throw them in and say, well, now you belong with that. And we hope that it's a magnet for you and their way of working will rub off on your team. It's interesting. But what about this? Think about this. Your team is not the only team trying to make a change. All those other teams are on their own independent journeys somewhere. Just because a team is where you want it to go doesn't mean they want to be there. And just because a team's near you doesn't mean they want to go in the same direction either. They all want to go in different directions. So what if you group by shared direction through PPPT space? Because they all want to go on the same transformative journey. You can work with them to become the thing. So imagine we had these teams, right? Stream, subsystem. Doesn't matter what they do. Doesn't matter how they interact for this conversation. If you're doing team topologies, it does matter how they interact. But for now, let's just think about this. Let's imagine they all have different goals. And I say that's a group of teams, but they actually have different goals. They're all going in different directions in PPPT space. What is the purpose of this grouping? How long will they be held together? Chances are they're going to be ripped apart. There's no reason for them to work together. But what about this? All those teams working towards the same goal. Is this good? And what will happen to that group over time? Will they have more natural reasons to work together or fewer? Do the teams have a reason to support each other? Can they support each other? Can they do something greater than the sum of their parts? And sometimes you can't give the same goal to all those teams, but maybe a cluster of very cohesive, directionally cohesive goals, where for some time it makes sense for them to be together, but maybe not forever. And you avoid them going in the wrong direction because you've clearly identified there's a dragon here and don't go there. Even though they don't have a shared goal, their goals are cohesive enough and the anti-patterns are super clear to them that they can be cohesive. Could this work? We need goal cohesion, but how do we do that? And so what I recommend is a virtual enablement team. So a virtual enablement team is a team composed of people virtually from the teams themselves. So you get somebody from each of those teams, they all come together and they work on this problem of keeping the groups aligned. Helps teams understand each other because now you have somebody from each context to facilitate those relationships, keep those communication flows working, fewer proxies. Helps teams maintain connections and cohesive goals. And it helps teams embrace a group level optima. Because one of the problems you'll see, and I think we've all seen this in larger organizations, is one team is really performing well, but they're performing well in a local optima for their team, or maybe even for their CV, for their career, but not for the group. So this enablement team lets them be something bigger than themselves. So you have this disconnected leadership mode over here, which doesn't work because, like, if you take a look at it, they're not connected by anything. There's no actual group. Just because I call it a group and I have group leadership doesn't mean it functions as one. Over here, unified leadership mode, now it works because I have somebody from each group representing the combined goals of that team. So let's take a look at that disconnected just to make that a little clearer. I want to peel back those teams and look at the individuals in those teams. What are the individuals in those teams doing, right? So you have streams, group leadership. Let's pull those people out. So those dots represent people. The lines are connections between them working on the same topic. Now those streams, they're all cohesive. They're all working together. And then we have these dotted purple circles, and they are the virtual members of those streams, right? They're just not working together on anything. There's probably some social connections in there, right? And that's great, right? They have pizza together. They go to the same guild. They talk. But we don't know really what those connections are, right? We don't have a purpose. We don't know the quality of those connections. We're not intentionally discussing a common direction through PPPT space, right? We're missing that about the work, about the company stuff. It can keep them together. All that other stuff can keep them together somehow, but it's not as effective. It's still beneficial, but it's not that great. So let's look over here at our unified leadership model. We have all those lines are connected, all working towards the same goal. And that's because they're all keeping the information flowing between each other so they can stay cohesive or make an intentional decision to break off. And over there, we just don't have it. So there's nothing telling them to work in the same direction. They're lacking that shared context and intentionality of connections. So our leadership groups serve no leadership function when we have that disconnected mode. You can have them, but they're just not serving their function. And it does not have the ability to reduce shared burdens from the team. That's one of the cool things about leadership teams. They can say, we're all experiencing this problem. Let's pool our resources together and fix that thing together. It's missing. No connections keeping the teams bound in a common direction of travel. And that's different from our unified model, right? So our unified model, we unify and align the mission. We seek the global optima because they're all working together, having that conversation all the time. We help all teams in a group sense the org, and we help teams create shared constraints that reduce cognitive load. So they can all do those things. They can all come to agreements on, we're going in this direction, we're not going in that direction through PPPT space. We're not going to build that kind of product together because we're doing this. We're not going to use that kind of technology together. We're not going to use those constraints. And if you ask a lot of architects, they'll tell you constraints is architecture, not technology choice. So we need all of these teams to connect. We've identified what teams we need to connect, right? They share a vector. So how do we bring them together? Remember, right? We have that social cohesion map. So we have work focus, we have individual, social, company. We start using those things, right? We start saying, okay, somebody from this team, let's join, we're in the same guild, we go get coffee together, we co-design a roadmap, and other people from those other teams, they're doing the same thing, right? So they're socially cohesive, individually cohesive, but we're missing something. And that, I think, is where, and I think that's this thing here, right? That's the virtual leadership team that's bringing everyone together, saying through our cooperation, we can mutually reduce cognitive load across the group by simplifying our environment and bringing clarity, making sure our things fit together before we have those problems. So those social bonds are still there, it's still relevant, but now we have this group that discusses those PPPT topics, keeps them aligned going to the same direction or cohesive direction. The trick with human information flows is that it needs to be easy, not just structural. And I think we've all seen that in public parks. There's a sidewalk and there's a dirt path between the corner of a sidewalk because the dirt path is the easier way across, but somebody's designed the concrete path to be the annoying long way around. It needs to be easy, and the structure should follow that. So let's think about this, right? We have 3 teams, yellow, green, and blue. How do people in these teams connect? Disconnected network with 3 teams of 3 people. Nobody talks to each other. Or we can have an ultra dense network between 3 teams of 3 where everyone is connected. Everybody talks to everyone all the time. And there's stuff in between too, right? We can have a sparse network between 3 teams of 3 where everybody's proxying information through their bosses and bosses get together and talk. Nobody in between talks. Or we have the more connected variant of that where everybody has a hub, but everybody can still talk to each other and they still figure it out. And those hubs might be different people, or you might have partial hubs, 2 or 3 people talk to 2 or 3 people, but it's not complete. My preference is that more sparse network, that second one from the left. That one makes a lot of sense to me because it allows for redundancy of information flows and allows better cohesion between the individuals, not just the managers. And it allows them to actually be cohesive and it doesn't overload everyone like that ultra dense network. And this has an interesting impact on how big your network can be. Because in an ultra-dense network, how many people can fit into a group is kind of constrained by how many people you can form those social networks with that belong in that second tier of connections. So this one here, you could probably put in everyone because there is no group. There's nothing holding them together. This one's probably the biggest group you can get, but it's kind of fragile, to be honest. And the one on the left is ultra-dense, probably wasteful, and maybe too connected. When we think about those connections, we have 9 people, 12 connections. Again, think about the connections, not just the nodes. This is actually very misleading, right? To say there's 12 connections here, because we need to think about the individual. So let's think about these red dots. So these red people, no individual in this group here has more than 2 connections, right? Every red circle has 2 lines, but those leaders between those teams, actually every one of them has 4. This is interesting because the typical pattern is to overload somebody by needing to connect to too many people, right? So if you say, okay, well, this person, you're going to manage a lot more ICs and you're going to be in a big group where you have lots of peers that you need to also align with. So you have 7 individuals and 5 managers you need to work with, you're probably going to overload this person. So I'm trying to represent that with these dashed lines saying you can only fit in quality relationships with so many people, which means those quality relationships will slip into that 4th tier of service, which is not where you want someone in your group. The map is not the territory. That territory changed. The geography, the landscape, it's different than what you planned because we didn't design with the human in mind and how humans work. So we've overloaded this person and now the group network is different. The information flows are different. The cohesion is different. So things will suffer there. And I think we see this, I think the most common example is this anti-pattern where you have a DevOps platform team that does all your cloud services in a company. The teams who have really cool social bonds with that team, they get everything. And the teams that are socially distant from them, they fall behind until usually an executive comes over and says, go focus on that team. And it takes them a long time to ramp up. That's that dashed line in practice. There's too many people for you to work with. Humans can sustain a limited number of quality relationships at each tier level. Your team is the closest priority at work. The group should be second. This orbit is ideal for relationships with others who are in a different team but in the same group. This is limited in size. You cannot reach the relationship quality needed if this size is 500. 30 to 50 tends to be reasonable, but I found you can actually flex this. And we talked about that as well, right? The type of network you have will influence how big that graph can get before we hit the bounds of those social limits. So let's look here. Can we make the limit bigger or smaller? For that, I want to talk a little bit about human information flows on cognitive load. Do we have waste in those nodes? And can we increase or decrease the waste and the capacity of nodes and connections? And in cognitive load, we have three categories. We have intrinsic load, extraneous, and germane. And I simplify it a little bit here to say intrinsic is how much effort is it, which is not simply a universal number. It's actually factors into the individual's skill. So if somebody's highly skilled, it's less load. You have extraneous, which is your environment. So how distracted is somebody? How loud is the environment? And then you have germane load, right? So the cost to learn something. There's this thing in cognitive load theory called a schema, and it says, as you have the intrinsic load you use is coming from a schema of information you build up in your mind. And the germane load is the effort to refine, improve, and expand that schema. That also takes effort and energy. And so if there's no room for germane load, you don't learn anything. Let's imagine an experienced brain surgeon performing brain surgery in a modern operating room with proper surgical tools. So it's somebody very experienced, very complicated task, probably a decent amount of intrinsic load. The environment they're in, the tools they're in has been designed to reduce the extraneous load to the maximum amount, best as we can, so they can not have distractions and problems. Unused load, there's lots of room there. They can get better at their craft as their intrinsic load reduces as they get better at that work. Or a basket weaver. Experienced bushcraft survivalist weaving a basket in a forest with twigs and bendy sticks. If you ever tried to really weave a basket with sticks, you'd know it's actually there's an art to it. You can get better at it. Still not brain surgery, but it's hard. But if you have no experience, you're going to really struggle with it until you do it a few times and your intrinsic load shrinks. But you're in the right environment for it, right? You're in the right environment. You have access to everything. You kind of have the same setup. But if we mix things up and we make it really bad, right? You can have a bushcraft survivalist performing brain surgery in an operating room with proper surgical tools. That's great, but the intrinsic load is really high because they have no experience with this task. Brain surgeon weaving a basket also has no experience with this task, right? Even though we use the best practice, the task is well defined, the environment's awesome, it's about this, right? And then we also have an experienced brain surgeon performing brain surgery, so task and individual really well set up, in a forest with bendy twigs, right? There's something, again, the extraneous load is quite high. Cutting into cognitive overload, you can't do that. Or you take it the other way. You take a bushcraft survivalist and you say, go weave a basket in a modern operating room with proper surgical tools. It's the wrong environment. It's the wrong tool set. It's not going to work out so well. Think about this. Any software developer will tell you if this is a production system, you're going to have a bad day. CPU goes up to 100%. We had a production outage, probably a P1 outage, depending on the service. Very common, all hands on deck. We got to solve the CPU overload. The CEO is probably saying, we need an update. We need an update. I have to tell my customers. I have to tell somebody what's going on. But let's change that here to a human cognitive load. And we say, oh, well, this person is at 100% cognitive load. They're burning out. And we say, yeah, it's their problem. They should figure that out. We don't have all hands on deck. We don't have emergency responses. We have, this is work. It generates slow flow, right? So that's cool that you shrug that off, but we have much more expense generated from this than the CPU at 100% because that human is impeding flow of information through the whole company, forming poor quality relationships, putting poor quality work into stuff with no space to grow and get better at their work. And they probably can't even do their work well not because they're bad, but because they're at 100%, right? So we don't run our CPUs at 100%. We say, 50, 70%, that's fine. But we're happy to run a human at 100% and think that's good. And we see that it's not good, but we keep doing it and we don't have the same response. So maybe we should run those humans at 60% workload and our next task can get better as well. instead of overloading them and dealing with the outcome of that being 25% of our stuff got delivered. Think about this one as well. I found this one fascinating. Trust is very important. It's common in Scandinavia to take a newborn infant in a baby stroller and park it outside of a cafe while the parents can go inside and drink their cafe and the baby takes a nice nap outside. We can do this in Scandinavia because it's part of the culture. There's a high trust that nothing bad's going to happen to the child. Lots of things in the environment and the other people in the environment and social expectations allow this to happen. This should not be done in New York City. Like, I do not think if you have a baby, you should park your baby outside alone in New York City and say, I'm going inside for coffee. Do not do that. The point here is the trust you have greatly influences the factors of how fast you can do something, the freedom you have to do stuff in an environment, and how much attention you have to pay to other things. I want to segue into Westrom culture. And so Westrom is somebody who talks about a topology of cultures inside of organizations and says there's three things. You have pathological, bureaucratic, and generative cultures. And I think we've all seen those in practice at some point in our lives. Pathological is information is used as a weapon. Let's not tell that other department we can do this. Let's embarrass this person with this special information we have. Let's hold on to some information. Let's surprise somebody at the last minute with something. Layer our agreement strategically to put ourselves individually at the highest position so we're able to get promoted, or my friend can get promoted and somebody else doesn't. Or we have bureaucratic ones, which say this is the process, you follow the process at all times. And the one Westrom likes to reference is in his actual paper on Westrom culture is a group of firefighters went into a collapsing building. Police department knew it was about to collapse, but instead of being able to radio the firefighters directly, they believed they had to follow the proper process and contact firefighter high command because they're a different department and trickle that information down step by step, then tell the firefighters. But by the time that happened, the building collapsed on them. That's a bureaucratic organization. And then you have generative, right? So information gets to the right people by any means necessary. The mission is what matters most. In a generative organization, the police would have just phoned the firefighter and said, hey, I'm going to call you. I'm going to fix this. We're going to get you out. A generative organization, how can I help you? Hard to find this, and it's also hard to be generative in a bureaucratic and pathological organization, but you can go so much faster in a generative organization than those other two. So do we have ways to increase and decrease capacity and waste? Yes. Dunbar load, cognitive load, trust, culture impacts the feasibility of those interactions, modifies constraints on group size, speed of flow, and cost waste. So pay attention to that stuff, and you won't need to hire a micromanager for every employee. We're done with that information flow detour. Let's come back and think about creating groups of teams. Can every team be in one big group? And you should know the answer is no by now, right? Because connection quality breaks down. Inability to go after multiple goals. In Conway's law here, this is Conway's website. It kind of tells you that your system you're going to get out of that is going to be one big mess, right? Because the software system will reflect the organization. One big group, one big system. We know we cannot maintain one big system. What was it that Conway actually said, right? Organizations who design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the organization structures of these organizations, right? The company structure ends up being written into software code. So what does that look like? Let's think about bad group designs, things we've seen in practice that we just don't like. And I think here's one situation where a team is constantly overwhelmed. So we have a smart stream. They don't want to reinvent the wheel. They prefer to leverage the work of others. That's a very noble goal, and I support that. Another stream provides an API. Smart stream uses it. Fantastic. Smart stream doesn't want to reinvent the wheel even further. They use something from everyone else. So all these different streams are coming together and providing something to smart stream. And all of those teams are regularly making changes. They all are shipping something different. Whether it's at their own cadence or a group cadence, they all have to make a change. You have the same problem, which is SmartStream will spend most of their time catching up to the changes everyone else imposed upon it. SmartStream spends most of their time catching up to the changes everyone else imposed on SmartStream. And that will happen whether or not you have all those teams working at the same cadence or on different cadences. You're still going to have to pay this price, and they will all change. SmartStream is actually slow and trapped by extraneous work, they kind of got themselves into their own position that way. Here's another common one, which I call locked in. So you have helpful stream. Helpful stream wants to solve a common problem for every team in the company. They see a really good opportunity to do that. So they say, okay, I'm going to expose this thing as a team API and say, here's a way for you to use my thing. So Smart Stream says, well, I'm going to use that thing from helpful stream. And then Brain Stream and Clever Stream and Bright Stream and Wise Stream, they all get together and say, yeah, we're going to use that thing. That's such a good thing. We're going to use it. And then helpful stream is popular. Everyone's using it. They come up with a cool idea. They're like, well, now that we know everybody's using our thing, we see a way to make it 10 times better. It's like a free gift for your birthday. So we want to release this gift. And everybody says, no. Don't release that thing. Why? And the reason is they don't have the backwards compatibility promise. When this gift is released, they're forcing every single one of these teams to change their development plans, to change something in the roadmap. They're being coerced into something. So they know that if this thing comes out, they're all going to have to trickle down and rewrite some big pieces of code, and it cascades work across the organization. We see this a lot with cloud migration platforms, right? So we want to move from A to B, cloud platform, database service, messaging system, simple API libraries that I've seen, schema formats. We keep seeing this again and again, right? So everybody's locked in and they don't have a way to upgrade in an easy way, or they don't have the freedom to accommodate this change. So Helpful Stream is now locked in. They don't have control over their own product anymore. Here's one that we talked about at the beginning, right? The group interactions. We entrench the teams that sound similar with bad boundaries. They lack a common reason to evolve together. It limits how quickly those teams can work together. And volatility is not between the types of things inside the same group, right? So it's the volatility being the thing that changes, right? The thing that's prone to change in the interaction is not between the currencies, not between cities that are over 1,000 kilometers away from each other, not between three types of foods that even if you go to an international food fair, you're hard to find all three in the same fair. Hard to find all of these things together, and their interactions just don't make sense. So what if we work backwards? And what does this look like in software? What if we apply that knowledge to teams? So we have this interesting thing called the principles of component design. And it's a very helpful set of software rules that help us think about ways to design a component, right? So a component's a way to group together bits of software like classes or functions, and we have to make changes to components from time to time. And then we have organizational principles of team design. This is a new concept. I'm just trying to say, what if we took principles and put it through that reverse Conway lens and said, well, what does that look like from an organizational design rule? It's like, well, teams are a way to group together bits of ownership over problems like software products or business outcomes, and teams need to make changes all the time. And then we have in software components, some things are long-term stable, like a web framework. And we have something that's volatile by necessity, like the landing page on an e-commerce website. You have to change that thing, depending on your e-commerce thing, like maybe every day. And then you have things that are through the reverse Conway side, right? So like we have that foundational platform team. They should be offering stuff that's long-term stable. Then we have volatile by necessity, experimental new markets. We don't know. It's experimental. It's new markets. We have to prove it. We have to look at this like completely new discovery. Everything's going to change. Nothing's stable here. What if we draw some dependency arrows here? So if an e-commerce page depends on a super stable web framework, there's no problem. That experimental new markets team depends on a super stable cloud foundational platform team. It's okay. Like they can get their job done. But if we flip those arrows around, we have some problems, right? So if the super stable web framework has a dependency on the e-commerce landing page, you're going to have the saddest developers I've ever seen. They're going to complain about having to cascade changes, do extra work, unstable systems. And yeah, you're going to have the same problem here, right? If the cloud team depends on experimental new markets because cloud's responsible for something that new markets is changing every day, it's not going to be so good. What if we think about it a little bit further, right? B depends on A, C depends on B, D depends on C. There's a risk here that disrupting A's stability will cascade to B, C, and D. So maybe we shouldn't design our teams like that. And I see this a lot, especially in workflow patterns where you have a data contract that needs to be passed down a workflow system, configuration files, data flow pipeline systems going from team to team, passing contracts along steps in a journey, and where you do user journey mapping, directly mapping to domains, directly mapping to teams. You kind of see this pattern. And so team D or component D, kind of free to make any changes at any time without disrupting anyone. And team A has the most pressure and scrutiny to not change anything. Like, please don't change anything, team A. And they have to spend excessive amounts of time to balance things out. This might be a better design because there's fewer of those cascades. A still has a lot of pressure on it, but C and B are freed up. And maybe we can do something intermediary between A and C that's not going to cascade, and it would reduce the severity of the problem. This could be an interesting way to group our teams together instead of the other way. And we also have this thing, which is the circular dependency. So components or teams, doesn't matter. If A needs to make a change to something that C depends on, and C depends on A, and D depends on A, and you have this loop, chances are you must make the change all at once, which means we have to go back and do this really big mega project to coordinate the changes between these teams. And you see this a lot, monolithic databases where everyone's touching the same table on the same field. For entities that should be different things, but are not different things, you kind of see this pattern happening where everybody's got to make the change at once and some supervisor sits over multiple teams. Principles of component design, there they are. I won't tell you what they are, but there are fantastic books in software architecture if you want to go find out about them. Let's think about that through that reverse Conway lens, right? So cohesion. So there's principles of cohesion and principles of coupling. So cohesion is things that belong together. Do these function together in a group correctly? So there's an interesting principles here that we can extract, which is no team in a group should coerce changes to other groups. Each team in the group must contribute to a common group boundary, product, team API, mission, ideally, all three, but maybe not always possible. Teams unrelated to that boundary will actually degrade the cohesion of those teams. Not every team needs to be in a group, but it's possible that sticking a team that doesn't belong into a group actually forces unnecessary stress inside of the group that brings them outside of where they need to go and slows them down. Teams can only consume APIs that have less business details. For example, they are more abstract than their customer needs. So no proxying products through teams. And you see that a lot, right? So this team makes a component that's shipped to another team and shipped to another team and then exposed finally, each layer adding some part of the product. So this proxying through teams, we shouldn't bind it this way. What about coupling? And I think coupling gets a little bit more interesting here. So do these teams that belong together, do they interact in a good way? And do these groups on a group level, do they interact in a good way? Every team exposes a stable boundary, a well-respected team API. If you're missing this, something's wrong. Team APIs are opt-in and self-service. And I think this is one of the hardest things for a lot of people to understand is opt-in does not mean high waste, right? It means, and it doesn't mean I hope somebody uses it, but it is necessary for the freedom of the team that they get to opt out of using something. So not everybody needs to reinvent the web platform, but that web platform needs to make a compelling offering and create the right social bonds to build the trust in their product to get those teams to use it. Forcing teams to use something forces unnecessary constraints on a team and they end up getting blocked, right? We've seen that time and time again. Each team in a group must contribute to a common group boundary, product API, mission, this stuff. Teams only consume APIs that have less business details. They're more abstract than their own domain. And I have a good visual for this you'll see in a moment. And teams that provide APIs to many teams must be abstract. They have fewer reasons to change their APIs and consider backwards compatibility and easy upgrade paths. So some hints on how to do that right. A backwards compatibility roadmap as a non-avoidable key design concern with many active API dependencies. Using APIs from too many teams will introduce instability, and it's amplified when those teams are volatile. Do not reinvent the wheel, but do not lose agility because do not repeat yourself is repeated as a organization level mandate. If two teams are frequently changing an API, they likely have a bad dependency cycle due to the wrong volatility boundary. Not always, but often. And when facilitating, and remember, facilitating is, I teach a team to fish. I don't do the fishing for them. Facilitators must bring abstract concepts and coach teams with that. If facilitators operate in the details of another team, they increase the chances of becoming tightly coupled. That doesn't mean they should not ask about the context and coach within the context. It just means they should not be doing the thinking for the team. They should be guiding the thinking for the team. So DVD came out in 1995. So how does that work, right? We put a DVD disc into the DVD player and it plays on a television. That is actually quite a good model for thinking about abstraction. So you have some details that are very close to the business and changing all the time. And you have some details that are not close to your business and should not change frequently and should be more stable. And the art of platform teams is not taking away those frequently changing business mission details, but providing something that simplifies and remains stable. So if you look at it, the DVD player, again, came out in 1995. Electricity came out 1880s, or at least became something common in households, came out in 1700 something. But it's been stable for a long time. The concept of electricity, the way we use it in our homes. I have electric devices that are much older than I am that still work on our electric grid. We have DVD players that came out far after the DVD player came out. And to make that work, like if you buy a DVD, you don't need to take the DVD player to a special maintenance shop to say, I need my DVD player to be compatible with this new Spider-Man DVD that I bought. You just plug in the DVD and it works. It would be absurd to do that. It would be even more absurd to go a level further and say, hey, I bought a new DVD of Lord of the Rings. I have to go to the power company and get them to change the electricity so that it works with Spider-Man and Lord of the Rings and all these movies. But we're designing our teams like that, right? We're designing our software and our teams like that, where we somehow don't allow a team to own their end-to-end changes and their end-to-end value. It's important to say, you have the stack of very specific business details changing rapidly, less business details, more stable, more abstract. And so that's DVD, player, electric grid. If we're not designing it that way and you have to reach over and change something, something's wrong. And let's also think about this one here. This one's quite interesting. We have this intergroup interaction switching between teams in the same group, right? Team A is using an API from Team B. And then they discover, well, we need to change something. This is normal. This is fine. It should happen. Not all the time, but it should happen. It should be long-term stable. You say, okay, well, now we're going to go back to that mode. And so you saw that here in the corner. It was easy to change because those teams are going towards the same stuff. They're aligned in PPPT space. It was mutually beneficial to them. They were aligned. It made sense. They were incentivized to do that. Intergroup. This is going to be slower, and this is because they have different directions through that PPPT space. They're not aligned necessarily. Could be that they're aligned on a macro level, but on a level that matters in the scale of weeks, it's going to be hard to get that directional adjustment. So they say, okay, well, we want to do something. We hear some initial whispers that we want to change course. And now we're collaborating together. We're going to start changing something, going to collaborate a bit longer, getting closer together. We had to change direction. We had to reset some goals, shuffle some stuff in our roadmap to make it work, but we'll do it. And then they can go back to normal. So it's just that it's slower to make a boundary change here than it is inside of the group. And if it's not working that way, something's wrong with your alignment and incentives. One more thing is to look at, we should bound those teams together by interactions and volatility, right? And I keep talking about this one, but it's such a common problem. We can have a Berlin experience, an Edinburgh experience, and a Toronto experience, and put things in there that make sense. These things interact together. They're likely to interact and they're likely to change. Versus across those groups, probably less reason to change. So having a slower boundary might make sense. It might even be desirable to have a slower boundary there to avoid volatility where we don't want it. So if we look at software component design and again, put it through that reverse Conway lens and say, what does this look like for teams? You can see that it looks an awful lot like team dependency and interaction challenges, where we reduce the frequency of switching from X as a service, you're just consuming something as a team API, to collaboration mode where we're trying to change something. And we reduce the cognitive load one team can coerce on to another team. And we reduce the switching cost of changing between X as a service and collaboration and back to X as a service, because you should not stay collaboration for long. If you do, something's wrong. And we avoid being locked in when working with other teams because we can get ahead of those problems here. So implications, right? Teams at the top focus on business details, change rapidly with the market, free to solve their own problems however they need to, including not using, and I've drawn here, platform A. So if they choose not to use platform A, they have the liberty to do that. And this is very hard for a lot of executives and directors and managers to get around, but you don't block flow if the team says this is slowing us down. So non-cyclical interactions are better. So we shouldn't have any loop-de-loops down. It's actually, I love this vertical stuff, especially from software architecture perspective. Minimize that cascade of change. We have something that can be changed quite easily. Gives everyone else the liberty to change modes and ship change faster. And then we get down here to this platform level, right? We should emit a common API, not a sewage dump of here's stuff you can use, right? We see that in software applications. Anyone has a util folder or a junk folder or a stuff folder, or you all have this in your software project somewhere, but there's a folder full of just random stuff that nobody knows what it is. That should not be your platform team. Don't be afraid of having lots of platform groups. And platforms are groups of teams that emit something that is cohesive and makes sense. And it might not be a single web API, but they have a common purpose. They have a common boundary of some sort. And it might be that it's small scope and then becomes two platforms one day. Users of APIs usually want to use most of everything offered. So if I'm up there in those streams and this is my cloud platform stream, I should want to use probably everything they're offering. If I'm looking at those software package principles and saying, oh, that's an interesting package, I want to use all those things, they should probably want to use all those things. Doesn't mean they have to turn on every single feature, but it means something in that offering makes sense. And that's kind of, again, tying into that first one, which is the offering is cohesive and makes sense, right? I'm going to launch a website. So I'm going to have a web server, a database, a cache, something like this, CI pipeline set up for me. Just give me that as a package of stuff I can use, but don't give me a weird financial calculation library that doesn't belong in there. So if I want to use a financial calculation library shipped as an API, why am I getting the other stuff? It doesn't make sense. So Soul focuses on removing complexity of the platform, right? They remove the cognitive load of those streams above, not the business details, right? We don't come over and steal their problem, right? We take away the things that make that problem hard to solve, or we give them something that makes it easier to solve. The speed of change of this platform group is sheltered by the platform leadership group in proportion to the speed API consumers can upgrade, to make sure that people who are consuming your platform can actually upgrade at the same speed that's being offered, not simply dumping, here's a new thing, get up to the new thing. And there's a lot of ways to do that. There's a lot of ways to offer your product to do that, but it needs to fit this constraint. Now, here's that last one I told you about, which is really weird and hard to explain. How many sandwiches are in this photo? And my English-speaking audience will say one. And so here's my Canadian family. They need to settle debate, how many sandwiches on this photo. And most people, well, actually everyone in my family says one, with some discussion of the nuance of it being cut in half. And it's unanimous, everyone agrees it's one. Now I live in Germany, and through my wife I have a German family, and we say, how many sandwiches are in this photo? And it's, again, nearly unanimous, two. Some discussion about the nuance, right? It used to be one, now it's two. This is also interesting because over in the Canadian one, it's 2 slices of bread is one sandwich, and it's one sandwich cut in half. It's still one. Same nuance being discussed, same photo, same everything, but two different cultures, not vastly different cultures. This culture says one, this culture says two. Same artifact, same interpretation of the nuance. Both understand it's cut in half. It's the same sandwich. It's just a sandwich. Could this problem exist for billions of other unspoken, unnoticed daily events in our highly complex environments? Yes. So at some point, there were people who believed that the sun revolves around the earth. And I think there are still people out there who believe this, and they're wrong, and I don't care. And here's one that says the earth revolves around the sun. And it's kind of funny because this is 200 years earlier than the other one. That's the sun, and those are the phases of the moon. And this is explaining why the moon looks different. And this is the model most reasonable people have of the earth goes around the sun, and the sun is at the center. But it's not true. And this is not a conspiracy. The earth revolves around the very center of the solar system. And so does the sun. The sun is actually revolving around nothing. It moves in a circle, and it moves in the circle, which is the average of all the gravity in our solar system, which ends up, year over year. You can see it here in 1945, it was here. At some point, 1951, it went to the nucleus and then out and around. Slight thing I have to mention because I posted this on LinkedIn, man-made climate change is real. This does not disprove climate change. And I'm deeply annoyed by all the weird oil executives in my LinkedIn thread who said something about this. It's included in the science. Don't talk to me about that. Have to say that because I saw too many dumb comments. Yeah, this model is more precise, but it's also completely useless to us, to you and I, right? We're not working in the space agency, right? We don't launch rockets to the sun. This kind of knowledge is incredibly important for the Parker Solar Probe, which orbits the sun, but not for most of us. Here's the Mars Climate Orbiter. Now, the Mars Climate Orbiter is something launched about 25 years ago, and in today's US dollars, adjusted for inflation, fully loaded cost, not the cost of the probe, but the cost of the research, the development, the launch, the everything, about $500 million US dollars, adjusted for inflation in 2024. So this thing was a cooperation between lots of different parties. There's a standard at NASA that says everything we're working on is in the metric system, right? That's meters, kilometers, this stuff. They worked with Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin wrote not a piece of the system. They wrote a single software module, one little software module. That thing was calculating in the imperial system. And so when you just take the imperial numbers and pretend it's metric, you're going to get really wrong information. NASA had an API standard. They said these two pieces should work this way. Convert the data correctly. They didn't. They used the context they're used to, which was the imperial system. The result is that $500 million project went up to Mars, got to the atmosphere of Mars, smashed to bits on the atmosphere of Mars, and just completely, it's gone in smoke, poof. Oops, we used feet instead of meters. That's it. This stuff's important, right? Monolith or microservices. We have two people with two different ideas. Which one's the right way? Now, 2024, I think a lot of people will say, well, everything has to be microservices, except for some of you, which are modular monolith is the right way. Which microservices has been quite popular. Go back in time 20 years, you'd be a fool to talk about microservices. Everybody would laugh at you. Monolith is the only way to do things. Big database, make everything heavily normalized. All the systems talk to that one central database. And this is the way we make systems in 1990. Two different clouds of ideas of how to build systems, both build banking infrastructure, both build healthcare. They work. Scrum or Kanban. I've had for a long time when I was managing teams, a very heavy bias towards Kanban. I understood Scrum. I don't like Scrum. I still don't like Scrum. But I had concrete issues making my teams interact with Scrum teams because we were not doing, here's the work we're going to do in 2 weeks, and here's the regular cycles we're going to have, and all these things you do in Scrum. And Scrum teams had a hard time interacting with me because where's your plan for what you're doing over the next 2 weeks? What's your velocity and all these other things? And I just didn't care about that. We both got stuff done, but we had a hard time interacting and making our teams work together when we needed to because we had this weird process mismatch. This is an interesting one coming into more popularity right now, like right now. Are we working on projects or are we working on products, where products are ever growing, ever continuing things that we need to have stewardship over, not something it's like that ever reaches a done state. It's forever going. So calling it a project is misleading and dangerous versus project, which is the other approach saying there is a done. When it's done, it's done. Yes, we have products and, but those products are composed of projects that increment it, and you have that kind of conversation. If you've ever, tried to convince some project-minded company that you have products, or product-minded companies, you have projects, you're going to have interaction challenges, right? And this one's something I see a lot in my coaching practice. Staff developers write the best code, and then staff developers write almost no code. And I've seen both models. I know which one I prefer. It's this one here, but it doesn't work so easily. You need a whole bunch of other things in place to make that work. Right? If you don't have a huge list of other cultural topics in place, it's not going to work. But making these two groups interact is a challenge, right? When you think you have a staff developer who thinks I'm good because I write code, and another staff developer thinks I'm good because I help other people write good code, you get a lot of conflict. And I think we've all experienced this when we've changed companies, because you always change your context and you've been drawn into somebody else's context sphere. So if you change companies, you might have a mismatch of opinions about good and what the role expectations are. That's you. You're on the border of ideas of things at your new company, and you have some things that are not in agreement there. I remember I once had a strange dispute in a code review many years ago because the concept of passing a function as an argument was not in the idea space of that company, but it was super common in the JavaScript world at the time, right? Especially many years ago, that was the way to do it. Have you ever gone through a merger and acquisition where it looks like this? So you now have two groups of people, some ideas in common, but like a ton of ideas in conflict. Or you can have a single set of ideas, which I think is actually not so good because you end up with stagnation. We have different ideas about stuff. Now, the thing is, do we have everyone in chaos all the time? We have chaos, confusion, misunderstanding, where nobody can agree and everyone's doing it their own way. Or we have it the other way, where there's one idea. So everyone thinks the same, stagnation, predictable, stable, this is the way we've always done it. Neither are actually that good. And I think we have this intellectual inbreeding can lead to collapse or revolution. So the system collapses on itself, or everyone gets so tired of it, they say, we're going to flip the table and change everything. Or this other way, which is repelling teams and individuals into their own islands, into their own bubbles, where they just don't need to interact, which is also a problem. So somewhere in the middle between those things, we get spontaneous innovation, generative challenge, unanticipated synergies, engagement. How do we get to that middle? We can apply forces. If you're in chaos, you can try to reconcile, integrate, and facilitate people together. And if you're in stagnation, you can try to disrupt status quo, inject new perspectives, interrupt this default thinking. Even if it's just playing devil's advocate sometimes, it's sometimes useful just to push people out of that zone, just to flex those intellectual muscles or make sure they still exist and don't go into atrophy. So how do we know which way to move? Do I need to play devil's advocate all the time? The best thing we can do is actually just try both, see what happens. So try to do one of them, check the level of resistance. And the one that's harder to do is probably where we are. So let's imagine this company we have in the software code. These are the if statements. Somebody over there is writing a flag and putting an if statement around it. This person puts braces on that line. This person puts braces on the other line. This person's using a ternary. This person's shortcutting it all and says, what's the point? It's just return 0. This person one-lines it. This person one-lines it with brackets. Everyone's doing it their own way. We are clearly in this chaos thing. And if we come in and say we should do it one way, you're going to get some pushback. You're going to have some supporters, but it's going to be hard. Go into the code base and do it. It's high effort. Versus if you want to say, I want to try it a new way. I've got this cool idea for a new way. I'm going to do, I don't know, maybe a switch case or something. It'll probably sail right through. Nobody will question it because it's already in chaos. What is the solution to this, right? So we are presently in a chaotic state versus a code base that looks like this. Every if statement looks identical. It's just like completely enforced. It must look this way. We're now in stagnation. And you say, I want to try this a new way. You're going to get pushback and say, no. That's not how we write if statements here. You say, we should try it the same way. It's like, yeah, of course, no problem, sails right through. So you're in stagnation. Not all ideas matter. Does it matter if the sun goes around the earth goes around the sun, or goes around the average gravitational pull of all the objects in our solar system? Doesn't matter. Depends on what you're doing, but a lot of things don't matter, right? Do you like apple pie or peach pie? Do you like pie? In the case of writing software systems, you probably not at all relevant. When we bridge those groups, we have to test ideas that relate to long-term humane conditions and fast flow of value change. So if it's not relevant to one of these things and it's not influencing that, it might not be the kind of topic that you need to test and make sure we have somewhere between stagnation and chaos. Test ideas on that shared boundary where they need to interact. We have that Mars orbiter, right? We have to test ideas about the data format. And we have to bring that to a level of attention where we don't have a group where things are stagnant in different directions, but open enough that it's discussed and visible and top of mind and actually being worked on, raising the awareness of it, raising the innovation in that space. Top 10 things to know. 1, groups that fast flow changes are not about reporting lines, similar sounding projects, or mega orchestrations of projects. 2, groups form as a way for humans to efficiently handle information flows. This will happen with or without a slideshow from upper management. And an overloaded human will force a de facto change, even if the design in a slideshow does not change. Human information flows influence total group size and switching speeds. This can be optimized or degraded based on cultural factors. Teams coalesce into flocks when they have common directions through PPPT space. Cohesion of the group comes from social bonds between the teams. Group cohesion is enhanced with a stable volatility boundary. Groups should be coupled on slow-moving boundaries. The deeper a dependency, the more stable and more abstract from the business details it must be. And high dependency counts or longer chains should be proportionally abstracted and stable. The deeper a dependency, the more stable and more abstract from business details it must be. Unspoken ideas have the ability to force groups apart or bring them together. A fast-flowing group is not a job assignment to give some teams. Working on the specific details that make flow work is how to get fast-flowing groups of teams. Here's a quick health assessment. Download the slides. Just very quickly, it's some questions to ask yourself. Does that group make sense? Do I already have stable teams in the first place? If you don't try to group together unhealthy teams. Do you know where the volatility boundaries are? Do people in a group have a way to create and maintain social bonding? Do teams in a group have a common set of goals? Is only one person overloaded with interactions? Is the work of a team generative? And does your culture support high trust? Does group leadership facilitate alignment of people, process, product, and tech topics between the teams? Is group leadership a virtual team composed of members of all the teams in the group? Do teams depend on team APIs that are more abstract from business than their own context? Are important ideas that impact fast flow on the boundary between two groups easy to change or hard to change? So that was the whole presentation I gave at Lean Agile Scotland. I hope you enjoyed it, learned something very interesting and useful about how to group teams together, how to avoid very common practices that don't help. Yeah, and if you enjoyed this, I'd love to hear from you and just reach out and send me an email. Have a great day and see you next time.